All right, it's a real pleasure to be here today. Can you all hear me? Yep, sounds like it. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is a new talk. It's my second SREcon, my first time speaking. So yeah, new talk. I'm going to be testing in production. I like that. Hopefully you guys do too. So can we get a show of hands in the room as to who here is building or is perhaps at the start of the journey or on a journey to building an SRE function in their company? Yeah, it's a pretty big show of hands. And how many people in the room work for companies where maybe you're at fewer than 100 engineers? Yeah, also probably 50-50. Cool. So I work for an edtech company in the UK. We're about 30 engineers. I started as the first SRE, and over the last 3 years, during a period of growth in the company, I've built that up to 4 people. And when I started, I thought, hey, this is a really cool job, but where do I get going? And you kind of think, well, there's this great book that Google wrote, so maybe I'll go and start putting some monitoring in. And I'll think about instilling a post-mortem culture because, you know, we like being blameless. And let's do some alerting. And over time, I found this really challenging to understand because without even noticing, all this other stuff appears that you realize you have to do. And you feel like you kind of have to do all of this to be able to play at this table. And it's easy to become despondent when you realize you just have to do so much more than you're capable of doing when there's just not many of you. So if we focus on one of these, we look at just Oncall. Of all these vital areas, this is perhaps the most vital. This is what keeps the systems up. And yet I realized really early that this isn't something that I could do alone and certainly couldn't do with my team of 4. A sustainable on-call rotation takes, say, a minimum of 8 people. And at the time when we started doing this, that was going to be 40% of our engineering workforce. We didn't have an endless budget, and I certainly didn't have endless political capital to keep hiring people. Similarly, we like to incentivize as SREs that we can encourage developers to work properly when we can hand back the pager, when we don't have to do on-call anymore. But when you're in a small company, you tend to pull knowledge. The SRE tends to know quite a lot about how the systems are put together. So handing back the pager could be a recipe for disaster for your company. It could lead to systems not running. Hey, it could tank the company. I also don't really like teams of 8 people because I can't feed them on 2 pizzas, but that's an aside. So it's easy to become despondent and question whether SRE is even the right approach when you do this. So let's think about why. Let's channel our inner Simon Sinek. Why is SRE relevant? And why is it relevant to small organizations, and why now? Because I think this community has come a long way in the last 10 years, and SRE is now becoming more than just a job. It's more than a way to engineer software. And as our users start to demand more from us, and as our systems get more complex, and we prove that we can take on these challenges as engineers, the SRE we know today is starting to be shaped by all of these other learnings from safety-critical industries and reliability engineering. I'm a huge fan of learning about how we approach safety in aviation, for example, and how I can approach that in my day-to-day. When I was at the start of this journey, I realized there seems to be some common challenges, particularly in these smaller organizations, that means it's a struggle to implement SRE. So I'm going to talk through 3 of them. There are others. One of them is, I don't know of another industry like the IT and software industry. Software engineering has huge leverage, where with relatively limited investment and resources, we can go and have global reach and achieve great things. It's easy for a small number of people to build complex systems with a huge number of features and really diverse user journeys in them, and then have to manage them. I remember this picture doing the rounds on newsgroups in the 2000s, and I think it captures this point so well. It's that complexity often comes and catches us by surprise. It's an outside context problem. We operate in worlds where systems gain complexity more rapidly than we can build capabilities to understand and manage it. And we know that when we try to solve these problems, we often create new ones, which we just have to hope are less critical. So what can turn out to be an internal process problem can grow to have counter-positive effects on your customers. And hey, that's not great. That's not why we come to work. If you've ever heard yourself saying, we'll figure it out later, or we'll automate that later, or it's someone else's problem, you're probably accruing complexity and not realizing it. And the third problem that I particularly find in small organizations, and why I think SRE can help, is understanding risk. Because when you're small, it's really easy to approach risk by just avoiding it. You think your systems are simple. We can add gates to solve this risk. When I started at my current place, and this is quite a common thing when I talk to people, It took us 6 weeks to get code from commit into prod. That's not okay. This idea of, for example, freezing production releases when things go wrong can be really jarring to upper management who are there to ship features. So coming along and saying you've exhausted your error budget, people just don't understand that. We've heard from people like Sydney Decker that when we try to build safety in systems, it's not the absence of something. We can't reduce this. We just have to build adaptive capacity to be able to manage it. And to be successful, I think SRE brings a culture where we train our engineers in a similar way. It can often be counterintuitive, but that's where I start when I think about implementing SRE. All right, so let's talk about where do we start. We're in a small company. We've built the capability to run SRE. I'm going to be transparent and controversial here, perhaps for SREcon, and say that not every company is probably right for SRE. I hope it's obvious from the work that the community has done over time that implementing SRE is more than just your technology organization. This is the cultural shift in how your company works and in how you engage with your customers and how you think about the customer. If your company embodies these principles, if it's innovative, if you've got a spirit of continually learning and being transparent when things go wrong, and if you're flexible and you're lean and you can move quickly, lowercase a, agile, then you're probably living in a culture that really can embrace and get some value from SRE. In that case, buckle up, because this is a months or years journey, and it's all about people. It's not just about engineering anymore. It's about how we think about people, our customers and our teams. So one of the things we had to really get right, and which took a lot of iteration when we were spinning out our SRE team, was working out how we organize people. And the conventional way that people often try, and certainly we tried this, is we think of this idea where we have an embedded model. So we label some people as SREs, and here's our SRE. And someday they show up to your team and they say, hey, I'm your SRE now. And it doesn't work. People just don't see the change that they're expecting to see because you've got one person out of maybe 5 or 10 people on an engineering team. Business continues as usual because there's no context sharing and there's often no joined up thinking. We've tried to create a cross-functional team in with reliability and ops coming in with dev, in an organization which doesn't really know how to think about SRE yet. This person who arrives rarely can influence the team. They often just become a back-end engineer, or maybe they sink under Oncall and this effort fails. So let's suppose that didn't completely fail and you've still got some budget and you've still got some people, and we want to try another way of doing this, and this is what we then did. We said, okay, let's spin out a completely separate team. That's not meant to advance, but okay, let's ignore that. Let's spin out a completely separate team and staff it with SREs. And it's really common to fill this team with internal transfers. These are the people that know all about your systems. They're the people that know where all the problems are and probably know about all the ways of fixing them as well, or at least have great ideas. And this team probably also ends up accruing things like running internal tooling, CI, CD, maybe they run monitoring and so forth. And over time, we found this became really problematic as well, because as the other engineering teams push away, you start to lose context in SRE. You start just becoming a tooling team. You start having people complaining at you because their deploy didn't happen. And in fact, you've reintroduced exactly what we were trying to avoid, everyone's foe. You've reintroduced this dreaded handoff word. We've inadvertently returned our ops model to the place we really wanted to avoid. SRE starts getting conflicting messages from dev. Well, you want us to do your deploys? No, we're not a deployment team. And you start to sink under all this toil and you can't get anything done. And trying to engineer our way out of this means that you either need to change the work or you need to change the people. But we just hired a team of people, so we can't really change the people yet. So that means we need to change the work. But in the process of sinking under all this toil, you've lost influence. You've lost the capability to go and effect change in those other engineering teams that you're seeing. It's hard to effect that change. For example, hard to build an understanding of error budgets and to talk about maybe focusing on reliability when it's not clear your team's even effective. And this is how it can often feel when you're in that mode. Everything's antagonistic. The answer that we really found to this, and the iteration that we're currently on, and the one that really works, is to build autonomy in engineering teams, to go and add value. It's similar to the talk we heard earlier. If you embrace a culture of you build it, you run it, then your developers really learn how to do ops. Everyone becomes an SRE. At SREcon in New York earlier this year, there was a great talk from Ryan Kitchens from Netflix. which really resonated with me. And one of the points in there was that your developers are the best people for managing your systems. There's no one else on the planet who's better. And this really helps me frame how to understand SRE. By putting your developers back in the driving seat, like we heard in the keynote this morning, it really helps them gain signal to understand how they're approaching development. You put them in control. I almost think of it like a control loop, where maybe they developed a feature too quickly and it had some bugs, or maybe they spent too long architecting it, and they can perfect getting this right without necessarily having to have another team looking after that. So when everyone's an SRE, yeah, everyone gains autonomy. I think in small organizations, this is really easy to affect because maybe you're all in one room, or you at least know everyone's names. It's really easy to go and make the change that you want to see in weeks to months. You might be wondering, well, these SRE people we've got, what do they go and do now? And even the best teams can have integration challenges because ultimately we have to ship software to our customers. All of these disparate user journeys have to come together. Saw this on Twitter recently, and I think it really underlines the fact that sometimes specs can go wrong. People can misunderstand. If we over-index on autonomy, the wrong solution might get created entirely. So those SREs we hired, we can repurpose them. They can still do useful work. You might be familiar with this hierarchy of reliability. It's in the SRE book. And this really underlines many of the things that you need to be able to do to run reliable production systems. We want our development teams to be autonomous and use the best tools that they have for the job. Sometimes that's going to mean that you need to build those tools and those processes internally. It's not productive for your engineering teams to reinvent all of those deployment and monitoring tools most of the time, because most of the time what they're trying to do is common. So what was SRE can often become what's perhaps called, in many places, platform engineering or production engineering. It's the process of building that shared tooling and making it available, having that conversation with your engineering teams. So they don't need to keep solving the same problems over and again. When we looked at this, we started at the bottom, we looked at monitoring, and we moved up to instant response and talking about blameless postmortems. In fact, the blameless postmortem culture was really the catalyst for everyone to start thinking about doing SRE. And what's more, it's really easy to do. When you focus on this, you realize that sometimes it's much easier to lead developers when you create the right incentives. We don't necessarily need to put controls in place. A really good example here is, for example, SLIs and SLOs. These are vital to all of us as SREs, and yet it's easy to over-index on them, to put loads of them in place, and then lose contact with the customer. We've got, in my team where we are today, without having too many SLIs or SLOs. We just focus on what those key customer journeys are, and we share that with our developers. Your people don't come to work to break your systems. They want to do good work. And by the way, if the thing I just said, if they do come to work to break your systems, then you need better people. Your people come to work to be successful. And most of the bottlenecks and odd behaviors that you see and where they don't change, they arise from a lack of context. If you put gates in place, people find ways around them. So if you've been close to the security community in the last few years, you might be familiar with this paper. It kind of summarizes leading with the carrot, not the stick. This describes some ways that security systems often fail in organizations. And it tends to be where we put too much control in without setting context and understanding of why that's a good idea. I think this is similar to what's happening in SRE, where we start to bring in psychological and human factors research into how we think about reliability. So after we do all this, it kind of makes me wonder, what is actually SRE? I'm still sat here thinking, am I doing SRE? Am I entitled to be still on this stage? Is that something that I should be doing, or am I doing something completely different? And I've spent a lot of time worrying about this, worrying about how we implement that word cloud that I showed you at the beginning. And when I thought about it, I realized, well, it's really easy in our organizations for SRE to be seen just as a cost center. But it isn't. It's really easy for us to put in sources of what feel like bureaucracy. If we think about SLIs and SLOs and error budgets, done well, they're really valuable. But done badly, they can feel like bureaucracy. That's not what SRE is about. Particular pet peeve of mine is when we think about SRE as a gatekeeper to production. Because while that's a conversation we might have with our engineers, it's certainly not something that we should be doing. We shouldn't be controlling if we haven't set the context. That kind of makes me sit here and think, well, what actually is SRE? How do I know I'm doing this successfully? And I think when you think about it, SRE is a force multiplier for your organization. It's a way of engineering ways for your teams to move quickly, for them to understand and manage this complexity that they're dealing with, for them to build and ship with confidence. Because in our goal-conflicted world, with all of the things we do as feature engineering and developing products, I think the lessons of SRE really are the best way to ship software that benefits our customers. And there's one final thing that I think really matters to make your implementation perfect. Our budgets are always constrained. Our resources are limited. Our time is limited. And we need to be able to demonstrate the success that we're having in our organizations. And finding the right signals to convey to upper management and to your peers that what you're doing is meaningful can be really hard. And one of the ways that I think we should be thinking about this is worrying about how your users feel. We know from people like Charity Majors that they've said availability is made up. The nines are made up. What ultimately matters is that our users are happy. So find the mechanisms that they use to tell you how they feel, and then measure them. Maybe they're sending you Twitter messages. Maybe it's support tickets. Maybe they're sending you datagrams on avian carriers. It's not the 1st of April. And sometimes you might need to go and use a proxy for that. And if you go and find positive values of success, positive values of impact, you can really demonstrate that your implementation of SRE is working. So for example, one of the mechanisms that we use is thinking about cycle time. How long does it take to get features from commit into production? And I caution here, actually, that avoid negative measures. Another measure that's often commonly seen, and which I've seen, is tracking the number of incidents that you have. But that's typically not a good measure of user satisfaction, especially if you use it as a target, because it incentivizes the wrong behaviors and it doesn't promote the effect that you want to see. We know we're going to see incidents. It's about how we manage them. There's one final thing I want to do, and I want to bring this back to the themes at SREcon this year. And one of the unsolved problems, or one of the themes is about unsolved problems. And I think when we look back into history, we see that people didn't know how to build pyramids to start with. The early ones fell down. Humans have been exception handlers for millennia, and SREs are no different. As a community, I feel like we've done similar to what we learned millennia ago when we sort of codified this. We worked out how to do architecture. We worked out how to build things that stay standing. In SRE, we've doubled down on that knowledge so we can build hugely scalable systems and architectures that our customers really value. We didn't get there without having a village, because it takes a village to build a community. And the SRE community today, I think, is growing and changing and welcoming people across all verticals. SRE no longer has to be a job role. It can be a philosophy, and it's a set of principles to help us drive forward responsibly and sustainably into the future. So I'm really interested to start a conversation and keep the conversation going about how you do SRE. It's been a pleasure to share with you today how we've done it over the last 3 years. It's not static, it will change. So keep the conversation going, or come and do a talk at SREcon and let us know how you're doing. So if you only remember 3 things from this talk, I'd say it's these things. Measure the positive value signals that you're providing. Dial up the autonomy and dial down control. And incentivize shared context with your engineers. Look for those common approaches that you can build. And I think your SRE implementation will go pretty well as a result. So thank you very much for listening.
We now have 5 minutes for questions. If you'd like to step up to that microphone over there, or alternatively raise your hand and I can bring you a microphone.
Over there.
Thank you for the talk. So you mentioned production engineering briefly. I'm curious.
Sorry, say again?
You mentioned production engineering as
Yep.
opposed to SRE. I'm curious to get your definition of what, or description of what the differences are for those.
Yeah, okay, that's a good topic. So while I was researching for this talk, I was kind of looking for how other places do it, particularly at small scale. And I realized we've been on a similar journey to companies like SoundCloud, where the term production engineering is often used. And at a different scale, Spotify, where you kind of have like ops without ops. I think production engineering is all about having conversations with your developers, but ultimately it's about putting them in control. It's about building common tooling to help them solve problems, but giving them the autonomy to then work out if they want to use that tooling or whether it's appropriate to use something else. I think the big thing that you can do as a production engineer, for example, in our stack is we provide common frameworks for instrumenting gRPC calls, for instance. We don't require that our developers use it, and if there's a need for them to use something else, then they obviously can. But there's a huge benefit from them being able to just spin out a service, and the monitoring and the alerting automatically falls out of it. So I think the real thing that production engineering is about is enabling developers and enabling them to connect to the customer and ship quickly. And yeah, sharing context with them as well. Helping them understand the systems that they're using. I think it's still an implementation of SRE, but it's perhaps a different way of thinking about SRE when you make everyone an SRE. And therefore, you kind of send a signal within your organization when you say, well, we haven't got an SRE team because everyone's doing it. Does that answer the question? Oh, hello.
Hi, Matthew. Thank you for the talk. Really interesting. How would you characterize the differences between this sort of style of SRE and maybe a more traditional sort of DevOps approach? Because it seems there's a lot of parallels. I was wondering if how you're differentiating this into the SRE space.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think when we think about DevOps, and I think we can draw down on a lot of the work Google have done here to talk about class SRE implements DevOps, which we probably all know. I don't think DevOps often mandates particular ways of doing things. And I think there's certain learnings that we can still have from the SRE community about, for instance, doing blameless postmortems. I said in the talk that was one of the hugely valuable things that we did as an organization because it helped people share context. I think those lines are very blurred. I certainly don't think I can tease out like that you're doing SRE if you do this, you're not doing SRE, but you're doing DevOps if you do that. I think we're all doing very similar things. But I think SRE gives you a framework within which to talk about this with your teams, within which to communicate it, certainly within which to attend events like this and find out how other people are doing it, which I haven't actually found in the DevOps community. It also perhaps helps you convey outside your organization the principles that you subscribe to as well. So when we go and hire, for example, we don't hire for SRE, but we can say we follow an SRE approach, and it provides a common language that you can talk to other people with.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Awesome. We have time for one more question.
Thanks. If an organization, is there any ideal ratio of SREs in a very small organization to people who are productive? In other words, have a certain output that can be measured, because what a sysadmin does is fairly thankless. We're just finding out fires and putting out fires. If you, for an organization, say, that has 30 to 40 people in it, is it unreasonable if, say, 5 of them are SREs, or does it need? Should it be more? Should it be a team that is interdisciplinary? So, for example, I'm more architecture, but the next person is more security, and then the next SRE knows everything about code profiling and reviewing?
Yeah, it's a good question. In fact, I think it's an amazing question, because if we knew exactly how many SREs we needed to hire, then kind of like we'd go and do it. So let me just unpack that slightly. So I think it's common in a small organization. So we're about 120 staff, 30 of them are engineers. 4 of them are SREs. So it's kind of ratios that I've got experience with. I think it's really common for everyone to wear many different hats, and obviously there's lots of interdisciplinary working that naturally happens as a result. There's also a lot of stuff that you kind of wouldn't expect to have to do. Perhaps in a large organization, you wouldn't start to think about doing, tracking your cloud spend when you're in SRE, but that's certainly something that I do day to day. But if you work somewhere larger, then you often have other people that do that. I don't think I can answer directly what the right number of people that you should have in your team doing SRE is, but I'd certainly say when you engage engineers and you really embrace these ideas, it allows you to kind of barter with engineers where they can say, well, these SRE people or production engineers or whatever we call them, they're really great because they're allowing us to move more quickly. And I think it's an organic conversation that you tend to have in terms of, well, do I need more engineers or do I need more people to enable the engineers? I'd certainly not say that 5 was too many or too few. I think it's very organization dependent.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. Let's give Matt another warm round of applause.